Gold Mountain from the Gold Rush by Liza Ketchum. The Chinese left few written records of their life in California, so we don't know for certain how news of the gold rush traveled across the Pacific. It may have been spread by a Cantonese miner named Chung Ming, who struck it rich at Sutter's Mill and wrote home to tell his relatives about his good fortune. In 1848, census figures listed only 3 nameless Chinese as California residents. 2 years after Chung Ming's success, more than 400 Chinese had made the long journey to the land the Cantonese called Gum San, or Gold Mountain. By 1852, about 20,000 Chinese men were living in the state, including 2,000 who had arrived in San Francisco in a single day. Most Chinese immigrants were young men fleeing terrible poverty. They did not intend to stay in California, and most had promised their families they would return as soon as they had made their fortune. One young dreamer was a 16-year-old named Li Chu. Chu grew up in the province of Canton, China, in a house made of blue brick. Although famines and wars had torn his country apart, the Li family lived comfortably on their own small farm. By the time he was 10, Li Chu was working in his father's fields. Each day he visited his grandfather, who told him stories about the terrible red-haired Fan Kui, or foreign devils, in America. When Li Chu turned 16, a neighbor who had emigrated to America as a poor young man suddenly returned home with full pockets. He took ground as large as 4 city blocks and made a paradise of it. The neighbor invited the whole town to a banquet at his new palace, where he served 100 roasted pigs and such an abundance of dainties that our villagers even now lick their fingers when they think of it. Li Chu made up his mind. In spite of his grandfather's warnings, he would take a ship to Gum San. At first, his parents protested, but finally, Chu's father gave his son his blessing and sent him off with $100, a small fortune in those days, which paid for his passage on a steamer and left him $50 to spend when he reached San Francisco. Most Chinese crossed the Pacific in small boats, crammed below deck in dark cabins smelling of sweat and vomit, their bunks piled up like stacks of coffins in a death house. The food was so bad and the seas so rough that one immigrant carved these words on the wall of Angel Island when he arrived: "I ate wind and tasted waves for more than 20 days. Others, like Li Chu, were afraid to eat the provisions of the barbarians. Epidemics swept through the holds of the ships. Some men who had been tricked into emigrating were chained to the boats and beaten when they tried to escape. A few threw themselves into the sea in despair. Those who survived staggered off the ships 4 to 8 weeks later, carrying their few belongings in double-ended baskets slung across their shoulders, their long back queues or single braids hanging to their waists, their faces hidden under broad-brimmed hats. Americans and Europeans were fascinated by the men they called the Celestials. They welcomed the early Chinese ships, eager to trade gold dust for the precious goods on board: dried fruit, candied ginger, lumber, brocaded silks, even houses shipped in pieces. Some Chinese found Gold Mountain right in San Francisco and never went to the mines. They took jobs in small restaurants with the Chinese characters "Enter and depart in peace" written on flags over the doors. They sold vegetables or worked in gambling dens. Many, like Li Chu, opened laundries. In China, washing clothes was considered women's work, but a man in America could start a laundry without too much money, even if he didn't speak English. Young Li Chu's first job was working for an American woman and her family. She taught him how to wash and iron the family's clothes, sent him to school to learn English, and paid $3.50 a week. Even though Li Chu sent money home to his parents, he saved most of his earnings. In 2 years, he was able to open his own hand laundry. Most Chinese arrivals, though, headed straight for the diggings, where they were an instant curiosity. Many Americans and Europeans had never encountered Asian people. The artist J.D. Borthwick was particularly interested in the Chinese he met in the mines. Coming on one group at supper time, he sketched the men as they cooked dinner and braided each other's queues. They squatted on the rocks in groups of 8 or 10 round a number of curious little black pots and dishes from which they helped themselves with their chopsticks. Borthwick wrote, "The Chinese welcomed him warmly, offering to share their meal, but he was too nervous about their unusual food to accept. Chinese miners were usually organized into companies of 50 or more men. They used a device known as Chinese water wheel, a series of buckets operated by pulleys. They diverted the water in the streams with wing dams, which cut the stream in half, leaving the rocky bottom exposed and dry for digging. Working long hours, 7 days a week, they often extracted gold from places where less determined prospectors had given up. Their first prosperous claim on Woods Creek became known as the Chinese Diggings. Many Chinese miners took their shares of gold to jewelers, where it was made into ornaments and belts. These could be stitched into clothing and hidden from American customs agents, so they wouldn't have to pay a duty on their earnings when they returned to China. Before long, Chinese success in the diggings made other miners angry. Whenever they heard about new Chinese strike, jealous American and European miners drove the Chinese out. They stoned them, burned their houses, broke up their equipment, hacked off their queues, and sometimes murdered them, knowing they wouldn't be punished. White men are not usually hanged for killing Chinamen, the San Francisco Bulletin stated casually. Violence against the Chinese also broke out in San Francisco. Children stoned Chinese workers, broke their bamboo baskets, and taunted them while their parents looked the other way. Restaurant owners fired their Chinese cooks or kept their identity a secret. People made fun of the Chinese for their loose clothing, their wooden shoes, and their habit of drinking tea. If Americans had boiled their water as the Chinese did, they could have avoided dysentery. Even some Native Americans who were treated as badly as the Chinese looked down on their arrivals from Asia. When someone was told he didn't have a Chinaman's chance, it meant his situation was hopeless. Li Chu's experience was similar to that of many other immigrants in Gumsan. His laundry customers cheated him and stole bundles of clothing. When he became a merchant, he decided that Americans treat you as a friend while you're prosperous, but if you have a misfortune, they don't know you. Every day he put up with insults, even though he realized that not all Americans were foreign devils, he insisted, until the end of his life, that their treatment of us is outrageous. Unfortunately, the Chinese were not the only people being hounded by Americans. By the early 1850s, an undeclared, ugly war against most foreigners was breaking out all over California.